George Hardy dies before sunrise, not peacefully, not naturally. His body lies in the wet grass while the flock watches from behind a crooked fence, silent except for the wind dragging through their wool. Hours earlier, George had sat beneath the barn lamp, reading them another murder mystery, laughing because he believed sheep understood nothing. He was wrong. Lily remembers every clue. Sebastian remembers every suspect. And Mopple remembers the strange smell clinging to George's coat. When the clumsy village policeman arrives and calls it an accident, the sheep exchange a look humans never notice. Their shepherd has been murdered. Worse, the killer is still somewhere near the farm, and one sheep may already know exactly who it is. By noon, the farm is crawling with boots, notebooks, and people who never look down. Tim Derry, the nervous policeman, circles George's body and keeps stepping over the same muddy hoofprint. Lily watches from the fence. Mopple sniffs the dead man's sleeve again, catching rain, smoke, and something sweet. Apples, maybe. Then a car arrives. Rebecca, George's daughter, climbs out with red eyes and a clenched jaw. The flock moves toward her, but Sebastian blocks them. Grief can hide guilt, he warns. That night, while the humans argue inside the farmhouse, Lily slips beneath the window and hears Rebecca whisper, "He wasn't supposed to find the letter." Then floorboards creak behind Lily. Not human footsteps, hooves. Lily spins around. It is Othello, the oldest ram, his white face half hidden in darkness. He has been following George for weeks, watching a stranger visit the abandoned mill beyond the orchard. Before Lily can question him, glass shatters inside the farmhouse. Rebecca screams. The sheep rush toward the door and find Tim holding a torn letter beside the fireplace. Most of it is burned, but 3 words remain. Sell the flock. Rebecca insists George changed his mind. Tim does not believe her. Neither does Sebastian. Yet Mopple smells the paper and freezes. Apples. The same scent on George's coat. Then Othello quietly admits the stranger from the mill always carried a basket filled with them. At dawn, the flock follows the apple scent through the orchard and finds the mill door open. Inside, beneath rotten sacks and rusted tools, Lily discovers George's missing ledger. Every page lists debts, land boundaries, and one name repeated in angry red ink, Tim Derry, the policeman. Before they can escape, Tim steps from the shadows, no longer nervous, no longer clumsy. He admits George discovered he had been stealing village land and planned to expose him. But Tim did not kill George. He only burned the letter to hide his own crimes. Then a soft voice speaks from the doorway. Rebecca. In her hand is George's blood-stained shepherd's hook, and her face has gone completely still. Rebecca's grip tightens, but the hook slips from her fingers and crashes onto the floor. She did not kill George. She found him dying beside the orchard and hid the weapon because his final words terrified her. Trust the sheep. Tim laughs until Mopple begins pawing at a loose floorboard. Beneath it lies a blood-stained glove, reeking of apples and machine oil. Othello knows that smell. It belongs to Gabriel, the mill owner who wanted George's land for a luxury development. Then the mill wheels groan into motion. Doors slam. Smoke pours through the rafters. Gabriel has locked them inside and set the building ablaze. The sheep scatter, Tim panics, and Lily sees one narrow escape, across the burning wheel. Fire climbs the walls as Lily charges onto the wheel. The wood bucks beneath her hooves, but the flock follows. Sebastian, Mopple, Othello. Then Rebecca dragging the terrified policeman behind her. One by one, they leap through a broken window into the river below. Gabriel is waiting on the bank with a rifle. He raises it toward Rebecca. Silence. Then the entire flock surges from the water. Wool, mud, fury. They slam into him before he can fire. And Tim snaps handcuffs around his wrists. Gabriel spits that George deserved to die for ruining everything. But Lily notices Rebecca staring at the recovered glove. Her face drains white. The glove is Gabriel's. The handprint inside is not. Mopple noses Tim's bare hand. Bitter polish clings beneath his nails. Suddenly, everything fits. Tim wore Gabriel's glove, struck George with the shepherd's hook, then planted evidence at the mill so the developer would take the blame. Gabriel burned the building only to destroy records of his land scheme. Rebecca steps back as Tim reaches for his pistol. But Othello lowers his horns. One brutal charge sends Tim into the mud, where the surviving ledger opens beside him. Weeks later, Rebecca keeps the farm and lets the flock roam freely. Every evening, she reads George's mysteries beneath the barn lamp. Humans still think sheep understand nothing. George knew better. In the end, so did the law. The strangest thing about the sheep detectives is not that its heroes are sheep. It is that director Kyle Balda treats those sheep with absolute sincerity. He never approaches the premise as a disposable joke stretched across a feature film. The comedy is there, naturally. A flock attempting to solve the mysterious death of its shepherd is inherently absurd, but Balta understands that absurdity only works when the emotional stakes remain real. Beneath the wool, wordplay and detective story mechanics sits a film about memory, grief, and the desperate need to honor someone who can no longer speak for himself. That tonal balancing act becomes the foundation of Balda's entire vision. Balda arrived at the project after spending much of his career inside animation and visual effects. He directed or co-directed The Lorax, Minions, Despicable Me 3, and Minions. The Rise of Gru, films built around expressive movement, carefully timed physical comedy and characters who communicate as much through posture as dialogue. The Sheep Detectives became his first major step into live-action hybrid filmmaking, combining human actors with digitally created animals. Instead of abandoning his animation instincts, Balda carried them onto the physical set. He storyboarded the production extensively and created a feature-length animatic even for scenes containing no sheep, so the crew would possess a visual map before shooting began. The movie's journey began long before Balda entered the picture. Nearly 20 years earlier, producer Lindsay Doran introduced screenwriter Craig Mazin to Leonie Swan's novel Three Bags Full, a sheep detective story. Mazin expected something lightweight. What he discovered was a mystery that could be funny, philosophical, and unexpectedly moving. Securing the rights reportedly took almost a decade, followed by another lengthy struggle to move the adaptation into production. Studio executive Courtney Valenti helped revive the project, while producers Phil Lord and Christopher Miller joined a creative team determined not to treat the material as second-tier family entertainment. Balda responded to the screenplay in much the same way. He found himself laughing, then being caught off guard by its emotional weight. Living near sheep farms in Oregon gave him an immediate research opportunity. After reading the script, he and his wife drove to a farm where he photographed the animals and began shaping the film's visual perspective. That detail matters. His first instinct was not to exaggerate the sheep into conventional cartoon characters. It was to observe them. The director recognized that the more physically authentic the animals appeared, the more surprising their intelligence, and the more affecting their loyalty would become. That decision created the film's most important rule: the sheep must remain sheep. They do not stand upright, wear clothing, or suddenly develop human hands whenever the plot requires them to manipulate an object. Humans hear ordinary bleating. Only the audience understands the flock's conversations. Framestore studied hours of animal reference footage, searching for real gestures that could carry personality, a hoof stomp communicating irritation, a slight shift in stance suggesting fear, an awkward amble becoming comic timing. Balda's animation background becomes invaluable here because animation is not merely drawing movement. It is deciding which movement communicates thought. He also wanted the surrounding world to feel believable without becoming tied too closely to one specific moment in history. Working with production designer Susie Davies, Balda shaped a pastoral landscape that feels warm, isolated, and faintly storybook-like. George Hardy's farm sits apart from visible civilization, reflecting a shepherd who trusts his animals more easily than the wider human world. The gleaming Airstream trailer, open hills, and golden evening light establish safety before the mystery darkens it. Beauty and danger occupy the same landscape. That contrast allows the film to discuss death without becoming emotionally punishing, while ensuring the cheerful surface never erases the sadness underneath. Hugh Jackman's casting as George becomes another extension of that strategy. The audience must understand immediately why these animals love their shepherd enough to investigate his fate. Balda needed warmth before mystery, connection before loss. Jackman's natural charisma gives George emotional presence, without requiring endless exposition. Around him, the production assembled live-action performers including Emma Thompson, Nicholas Braun, Molly Gordon, and Hong Shao, alongside Sheep, voiced by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Bryan Cranston, Chris O'Dowd, Regina Hall, Patrick Stewart, and Bella Ramsey. Craig Mazin wrote the screenplay, while Doran, Tim Bevan, and Eric Fellner produced the film. This is what makes Balda such an unexpectedly precise choice. A filmmaker known for frantic animated comedy enters a murder mystery and discovers stillness, sorrow, and pastoral tenderness without losing his instinct for visual humor. He approaches the project collaboratively, but the governing philosophy remains clear. Never mock the sheep, never dilute the grief, and never assume younger audiences require emotional dishonesty. The ridiculous premise opens the door. Sincerity keeps us inside. But a director's vision needs a carefully engineered narrative beneath it. And the screenplay's 20-year journey contains mysteries nearly as fascinating as the one the flock must solve. That foundation was built by Craig Mazin, although built hardly captures the amount of time involved. Producer Lindsay Doran brought Leonie Swan's novel 3 Bags Full to Mazin roughly 17 years before the film's release, pitching it with one irresistible sentence: "A shepherd is murdered, and his sheep solve the crime." Mazin expected an amusing talking animal adventure. Instead, the book left him deeply moved. The concept offered comedy, but its emotional engine was innocence confronting mortality. Doran then spent 7 years untangling the rights before Mazin could write the screenplay, which he completed around a decade before the finished movie reached audiences. The timing makes the script fascinating within Mazin's career. When he first encountered the novel, he was associated mainly with broad studio comedies such as Scary Movie 4 and The Hangover Part 2. By the time The Sheep Detectives finally appeared, he had created Chernobyl and co-created The Last of Us, projects known for moral complexity, death, and the emotional cost of survival. Yet the film was not simply Mazin applying his later prestige drama reputation to children's material. The screenplay had been sitting there all along. Its combination of silliness and sadness was evidence that this dramatic instinct existed before the industry decided to recognize it. What delayed the film was partly the very quality that makes it distinctive. Studios understood where to place a completely ridiculous talking animal comedy. They also understood where to place a dark murder mystery, a story that genuinely wanted to be both created uncertainty. According to Mazin, executives struggled to categorize the screenplay until MGM's Courtney Valenti backed the project without demanding that its emotional complications be stripped away. That choice protected the script's central tension. The sheep are adorable, but George's death is not pretend. The film can make a joke about grass one moment and ask what remains of someone after death the next. Neither mode cancels the other. Mazin's model was not the average celebrity-voiced animal comedy. It was Babe, another film that uses animal innocence to examine ideas far larger than its family-friendly packaging suggests. The sheep in The Sheep Detectives are adults in a biological sense, yet emotionally they resemble children encountering dishonesty, violence, and loss for the first time. That gives the screenplay a disguised coming-of-age structure. Lily, Mopple, and the rest of the flock are not merely collecting clues. They are learning that people conceal motives, that love does not prevent harm, and that understanding George requires accepting parts of his life they never witnessed. The investigation becomes education, painful education. The mystery itself demanded a colder kind of craftsmanship. Mazin, who has said he read every Agatha Christie novel, described writing a whodunit as a process of mathematics and interlocking gears. Every suspect needs motive, opportunity, and enough ambiguity to remain plausible. Every clue must be visible without appearing highlighted. Plant something too quietly and the solution feels unearned. Emphasize it too heavily, and the audience arrives before the detectives. Mazin therefore writes on 2 tracks at once. One track concerns machinery, evidence, misdirection, and revelation. The other concerns feeling, how the sheep change while attempting to understand the machinery. Here is where the film's limited perspective becomes its smartest narrative device. George's flock knows him intimately, but understands almost nothing about human society beyond the pasture. Ordinary behavior can look suspicious to them, while obvious human deception may pass unnoticed because they lack the social vocabulary to recognize it. That gap creates comedy without making the animals stupid. Their deductions are often logical, their premises are simply incomplete. Meanwhile, the human investigator Tim Derry struggles for different reasons. He possesses procedural knowledge but lacks confidence and instinct. The sheep slowly learn how people behave, while Tim effectively learns police work from sheep. Two incomplete investigations move toward the same truth. Adapting the novel required substantial compression. Swan's book contains more sheep than a feature film can comfortably distinguish, so Mazin combined several characters while preserving what he considered essential: the flock's innocence, individual personalities, and emotional growth. He also altered the nature of the final solution to make the story suitable for a genuinely broad audience. That is a dangerous adaptation choice, because softening darkness can flatten meaning. Mazin avoids the worst of that trap by keeping death permanent and grief central. The precise explanation changes, but the sheep still have to face a world in which their protector cannot return. The humor follows the same discipline. Mazin did not approach family writing as adult comedy with the sharper edges removed. He wanted jokes that children and adults could enjoy together without either group feeling ignored. No endless references inserted solely to keep parents awake. No crude gag awkwardly disguised as innocence. The comedy grows from character, Mopple's appetite, Othello's intensity, Tim's uncertainty, and the flock's literal interpretation of detective fiction. Because the mystery is tightly engineered, and the animated performances had to be coordinated with live action, the actors largely followed the screenplay rather than improvising freely. Small departures were possible. Structural wandering was not. The result is a script operating as cozy mystery, animal comedy, and grief story without fully surrendering to any single label. Its occasional sentimentality is visible, but sentiment is not automatically dishonesty. Mazin earns the tenderness by letting the flock misunderstand, fail, and discover uncomfortable truths before offering emotional release. The sheep begin the story, believing detective novels have prepared them for murder. They have not. Stories only give them a language through which to begin. But even the most carefully written character remains an abstraction until an actor gives it rhythm, personality, and breath. And assembling the human and vocal cast would become the production's next delicate mystery. Casting the sheep detectives meant solving two different problems at once. The human actors had to inhabit a heightened village mystery without treating it as pantomime, while the voice performers had to turn visually realistic sheep into distinct personalities without leaning on cartoon accents or exaggerated animal noises. One weak link could have collapsed the illusion. Make the people too broad and George's death becomes meaningless. Make the sheep too solemn and the premise loses its comic spark. The finished ensemble works because nearly every performer was selected for contrast: warmth against suspicion, confidence against vulnerability, polished authority against complete social panic. Hugh Jackman was the essential first piece. George Hardy appears for a relatively limited portion of the story, yet his absence controls everything that follows. The flock's investigation only matters if the audience believes these animals experienced genuine safety in his care. Jackman brings that trust almost automatically. His screen image contains theatrical showmanship, action star strength, and an unusually open emotional warmth. Kyle Balda does not need to spend half the film proving George is lovable. Jackman walks into the pasture, reads aloud, and makes affection feel habitual rather than performed. The casting buys emotional history before the screenplay has time to explain it. Emma Thompson serves a very different purpose as Lydia Harbottle. She arrives carrying the authority of an actor who can make formal language sound both intelligent and faintly dangerous. That matters in a whodunit, where every polished sentence may be concealing another motive. Thompson can suggest competence, impatience, and eccentricity without forcing the audience to choose between them. Balda specifically praised the contrast between her performance and Nicholas Braun's, and that contrast becomes a miniature version of the film's casting philosophy. Thompson controls the space. Braun appears apologetic for occupying any of it, Put them in the same frame, and the power dynamic writes itself. Braun as Officer Tim Derry may be the film's most revealing against-type decision. He remains associated with awkward, uncertain men, but Tim cannot simply become Cousin Greg wearing a police uniform. The character needs comic discomfort, certainly, yet he must also grow into someone capable of earning the flock's trust. Braun developed an English accent with dialect coach William Conacher, settling on a hybrid estuary sound positioned between London speech and a more rural register. He reportedly rehearsed unfilmed portions of the script daily and studied English speakers at reduced playback speed to absorb their rhythm. That preparation prevents the accent from becoming a joke pasted onto the performance. Molly Gordon's Rebecca Hampstead requires another kind of calibration. As George's daughter, she carries emotional information the sheep cannot access and personal history that complicates their idealized image of him. Gordon is particularly effective at playing characters whose humor operates as self-protection. She can deliver irritation without closing off sympathy, allowing Rebecca to feel estranged rather than simply cold. Nicholas Galitzine, Hong Shao, Tosin Cole, Kobna Holdbrook-Smith and Conleth Hill help populate the suspect pool with sharply different energies, while the presence of performers experienced in drama and comedy keeps the village from becoming a collection of obvious red herrings. Then comes the flock, and this is where the casting becomes almost musical. Julia Louis-Dreyfus voices Lily with the intelligence necessary for a believable amateur detective, but Balda was equally interested in the vulnerability beneath that certainty. Lily believes detective stories have taught her how the world works. Grief exposes how little those tidy fictional patterns can prepare her for. Louis Dreyfus initially questioned how one even plays a sheep, then discovered that the role did not require artificial bleeding or vocal gimmickry. Her own clarity, timing, and emotional control became the character. The less she performs sheep, the more Lily feels alive. Chris O'Dowd's Mopple is built around memory, and his voice carries exactly the right mixture of kindness and exhaustion. Balda heard sweetness and experience in O'Dowd's delivery, qualities essential for a character who knows more than the rest of the flock, but understands that truth can wound. O'Dowd described Mopple as resembling an older relative who possesses painful family secrets and must decide when others are ready to hear them. That idea changes the character from comic sidekick into emotional custodian. Mopple remembers because somebody must. O'Dowd makes that responsibility sound heavy even when the dialogue remains playful. Bryan Cranston's Sebastian needed weight of a harsher variety. Balda identified the history, gravel and gravitas in Cranston's voice as crucial to the character's statuesque presence. Sebastian is not merely the serious sheep. His manner suggests experience beyond the pasture and pain the others cannot initially understand. Cranston's casting uses audience memory intelligently. We recognize the command in that voice, but the film redirects it toward loneliness and survival. Opposite him, Regina Hall brings ambition to Cloud. Patrick Stewart supplies solemn dignity to Sir Richfield. Bella Ramsey gives Zora youthful momentum. Rhys Darby adds nervous eccentricity. And Brett Goldstein doubles the disruptive energy as Reggie and Ronnie. The voice ensemble is star-heavy, but celebrity recognition is not the governing joke. Each familiar voice occupies a separate emotional frequency. Louis-Dreyfus thinks quickly. O'Dowd absorbs. Cranston broods. Stewart pronounces. Ramsey questions. Hall pushes forward. That separation is vital because the sheep cannot rely on clothing, human gestures, or radically anthropomorphic designs to identify themselves. Their bodies remain recognizably animal, so vocal rhythm performs much of the character differentiation. The casting gives Framestore's restrained animation something precise to follow, rather than forcing the visual effects to manufacture personality alone. No widely documented alternate cast or failed chemistry test is needed to make these choices interesting. The surprise lies in how carefully established screen identities are redirected. Jackman's warmth becomes a ghostly presence. Braun's discomfort becomes investigative growth. Louis-Dreyfus trades comic aggression for fragile intelligence. Cranston turns authority into wounded isolation. On paper, it looks like a collection of famous names surrounding digital sheep. On screen, it becomes a system of complementary voices and temperaments. And once those performers were assembled, the larger challenge began, transforming strong casting into performances capable of carrying grief, comedy, and mystery without tearing the film's delicate tone apart. The performance that defines the Sheep Detectives belongs to Julia Louis-Dreyfus, even though the face carrying it is covered in wool. Lily begins with the confidence of someone who has consumed enough detective stories to believe murder follows rules. Clues lead somewhere. Suspects behave suspiciously. The cleverest investigator eventually restores order. Louis-Dreyfus gives that certainty a brisk, almost managerial rhythm, but she never turns Lily into an animal version of one of her famous television characters. The comic sharpness is familiar. The innocence underneath it is not. Director Kyle Balda described Lily as intelligent and clear-minded, but emotionally unprepared for what the investigation forces her to feel. That difference matters because Lily's real journey is not from confusion to deduction. It is from deduction to grief. She thinks solving George's death will make the world comprehensible again, yet every discovery complicates the shepherd she believed she understood completely. Louis-Dreyfus lets Lily's authority gradually lose its armor. Her delivery becomes less declarative. Pauses begin appearing where certainty once lived. The visual effects team can animate an ear-lowering or a hoof-shifting, but the emotional meaning arrives through the voice. A slight hesitation, a tightened sentence, an attempt to sound brave that lasts half a second too long. Tiny choices, huge effect. Voice performances often become louder when animators give actors no human face to rely upon. Louis-Dreyfus goes the opposite direction. She resists vocal decoration and plays Lily's thoughts cleanly, trusting the audience to connect her controlled delivery with the realistic body language created by Framestore. Balda wanted the flock to move like actual sheep rather than cartoon characters, using natural gestures such as stomping, turning, and ambling to communicate personality. Louis-Dreyfus's restraint fits that rule perfectly. The performance does not compete with the animation. It leaves space for it. Voice and body meet somewhere between human emotion and animal behavior, and Lily emerges from that meeting as a character rather than a gimmick. Hugh Jackman faces the opposite challenge. George must become the emotional center of a film that removes him near the beginning. Jackman has limited screen time to establish years of tenderness between the shepherd and his flock, so he plays familiarity rather than announcement. George does not behave as though he is demonstrating kindness for the audience. He reads to the sheep because that is simply what their evenings look like. He treats their individual habits as known facts. The warmth feels routine, which makes it convincing. Critics repeatedly noted that Jackman's charisma makes the flock's devotion understandable, and the film depends on that immediate bond. Watch what Jackman avoids. No exaggerated saintliness. No desperate attempt to make George lovable through a parade of noble speeches. There is loneliness in him, but it sits beneath the genial surface rather than becoming a performance of sadness. Jackman's musical theater openness, his ability to communicate directly without appearing guarded, helps George feel emotionally available to animals even when he is withdrawn from people. His death, therefore, creates two mysteries. Who killed him? And why did a man capable of such uncomplicated affection build such a complicated human life? Jackman remains present after disappearing because every new revelation must be measured against the version of George he gave us. Nicholas Braun has the least forgiving assignment. Officer Tim Derry is awkward, unprepared and frequently several steps behind the sheep, which places Braun dangerously close to repeating the anxious physical comedy that made him famous in Succession. At first, the resemblance is impossible to ignore. The uncertain posture, delayed responses, and sense that every conversation has started before Tim understands the rules. Yet Braun gradually separates the characters. Tim's confusion is not opportunistic. It comes from low self-worth. He wants to become useful, but the town has already decided he is not. That sadness gives the fumbling a human center. Braun also performs the role in an English accent developed with dialect coach William Conacher. He rehearsed unfilmed sections of the script daily and studied recordings of English speakers at reduced speed to absorb their rhythm. aiming for an estuary-influenced voice suited to the rural setting. The result divided some viewers, and occasionally the technical effort is audible. You can hear him shaping a sound rather than simply speaking it. Yet the slight stiffness sometimes helps Tim. This is a man uncomfortable in his uniform, his authority, and nearly every room he enters. Even when the accent draws attention to itself, Braun's emotional objective remains clear. Tim wants to matter. His best work comes when the performance stops asking us to laugh at incompetence and begins asking us to recognize persistence. Tim does not transform into a commanding detective overnight. Braun keeps the uncertainty alive even as the character becomes more observant. His spine straightens before his voice does. His deductions arrive with the nervous energy of someone expecting interruption. That gradual change prevents the arc from becoming a cheap makeover in which confidence magically replaces personality. The Guardian praised Braun's comic performance and accent, while other responses were less persuaded by the casting. Both reactions make sense. He never fully escapes the shadow of Cousin Greg, but he finds enough sincerity inside the familiar awkwardness to make Tim worth following. Molly Gordon provides the film's most grounded human performance as Rebecca, George's estranged daughter. Where the sheep mourn an idealized guardian, Rebecca carries resentment, unfinished history, and the exhaustion of being judged by strangers who know only one version of her father. Gordon refuses to simplify that conflict. Her sarcasm lands, but it feels defensive rather than cruel. Her grief arrives sideways, in impatience, guarded glances, and moments when anger collapses into something less manageable. She also had to perform many scenes opposite puppets, stuffed stand-ins, and cardboard eyeline markers rather than finished digital animals, which required her to imagine emotional exchanges that would not exist visually until post-production. That technical challenge makes Gordon's restraint more impressive. Actors facing non-existent creatures can overcompensate, throwing energy toward empty space so editors have something usable later. Gordon stays contained. She allows Rebecca's discomfort around the flock to feel like an extension of her discomfort with George's memory. Her chemistry with Braun is intentionally ungainly rather than romanticized. Both characters are uncertain people being pushed together by circumstances neither controls. The connection occasionally lacks spark, but emotional neatness would betray them. Rebecca is not present to reward Tim, and Tim is not there to repair her grief. They simply begin seeing each other more clearly. Together, Louis-Dreyfus, Jackman, Braun, and Gordon hold the film's unstable tone in place. Louis-Dreyfus supplies intelligence becoming vulnerability. Jackman creates love strong enough to survive absence. Braun turns embarrassment into perseverance. Gordon gives grief its sharpest human edges. None of these performances works alone. Each gains meaning from the contrasting energies around it. And surrounding those leads is a flock of voices, suspects, eccentrics, and scene stealers whose smaller contributions give the mystery its texture. Because this story may follow Lily, but it only comes alive when the entire ensemble starts pulling in different directions. The ensemble's greatest achievement is making a flock feel like a community rather than a collection of celebrity voices. Lily may drive the investigation, but she cannot carry its emotional burden alone. Around her, every sheep responds to George's death differently. Mopple remembers, Sebastian withdraws, Cloud asserts herself, Zora asks questions, Sir Richfield offers grand declarations, and Reggie and Ronnie would prefer to solve most problems by charging directly into them. Those conflicting instincts create movement inside the group. The flock argues because it matters to them. Their disagreements are not filler between clues, they are grief taking several forms at once. Chris O'Dowd gives Mopple the ensemble's gentlest presence. Director Kyle Balda identified a sweetness and sense of experience in O'Dowd's voice, and both qualities shape the character's role as the flock's memory keeper. Mopple is frequently funny because his patience borders on resignation, yet O'Dowd never treats him as merely slow or sleepy. He listens. He absorbs. When the others rush toward conclusions, Mopple carries knowledge they are not ready to confront. His warmth makes exposition feel like remembrance rather than information delivery, while his chemistry with Louis-Dreyfus creates an appealing contrast. Lily wants answers immediately. Mopple understands that some answers change the people who receive them. Bryan Cranston's Sebastian supplies the opposite energy. His gravelly delivery gives the character history before the screenplay fully explains it. Balda described Cranston's voice as carrying weight and gravitas, qualities that help Sebastian feel physically and emotionally separate from the flock. He is not simply brooding for dramatic effect. His cynicism challenges Lily's belief that determination and logic can repair every wound. Cranston himself described Sebastian's contrasting perspective as essential because a story becomes flat when nobody resists the central character's assumptions. That friction gives the flock depth. Lily represents faith in understanding. Sebastian represents the knowledge that understanding does not always bring comfort. The smaller sheep roles prevent that central trio from becoming too solemn. Regina Hall gives Cloud an ambitious, self-important spark, playing confidence as both comedy and survival mechanism. Patrick Stewart voices Sir Richfield with the sonorous authority of a Shakespearean monarch, which makes even his least reliable deductions sound momentous. Bella Ramsey's Zora brings impatient curiosity, the energy of the youngest member who refuses to accept an explanation merely because an adult delivered it. Brett Goldstein doubles himself as Reggie and Ronnie, rowdy twin rams, whose enthusiasm for physical confrontation turns group panic into kinetic comedy. Each performance is broad enough to register quickly, but none feels disconnected from the flock's shared emotional reality. Here is what makes the voice ensemble work. Nobody appears to be performing in the same genre, yet the characters belong in the same world. Stewart sounds as though he wandered in from classical theater. Hall brings modern comic precision. Goldstein uses blunt aggression. Ramsey fires questions with restless speed. O'Dowd seems to have been awake for several centuries. Cranston could narrate an ancient warning carved into stone. Those textures should clash. Instead, they resemble the varied personalities of an actual family, where affection does not require similarity. Framestore's realistic animal movement gives them a shared physical language. While the voices provide the emotional differences, the bodies cannot exaggerate. The live-action supporting players perform another necessary function. They keep every human interaction faintly suspicious. Nicholas Galatzine's Elliot Matthews brings the forward momentum of a journalist who sees opportunity inside tragedy. Hong Chow, as Beth Pennock, can turn stillness into scrutiny. She rarely needs a large gesture to suggest that a character knows more than she intends to share. Tosin Cole's Caleb Marrow, Conleth Hill's Butcherham Gilliard, Kobna Holdbrook Smith's Reverend Hillcoat, and Mandeep Dillon's Postwoman Joe fill Denbrook with recognizable village types while avoiding complete transparency. In a mystery, vivid characterization is camouflage. The more entertaining the suspect, the less urgently the audience examines the mechanics beneath the performance. Emma Thompson comes closest to stealing the film outright. Lydia Harbottle enters with formidable composure, colorful costumes, and the verbal precision of someone who considers every conversation a negotiation she has already won. Thompson's scenes opposite Nicholas Braun thrive on imbalance. Lydia is controlled, articulate, and socially lethal. Tim appears to be assembling each response while speaking it. Balda singled out that contrast as one of the ensemble's pleasures, and it is easy to see why. Thompson does not chase jokes. She simply allows Lydia's impatience to sharpen each line until Braun's discomfort becomes the punchline. Her limited screen time leaves the film wanting more of her, which is both a compliment and a genuine structural frustration. Not every supporting character receives equal space. The crowded suspect list sometimes reduces talented performers to striking entrances, suspicious glances, and one defining comic trait. Hong Chow and Thompson, in particular, could support far more material than the screenplay gives them. Yet that compression also suits the cozy mystery design. Denbrook must feel larger than the investigation, populated by people whose lives continue beyond whatever the sheep happen to observe. The ensemble creates that illusion. Even a brief appearance suggests another relationship, another resentment, another possible motive waiting outside the frame. The sheep may misunderstand human behavior, but the cast ensures there is always behavior worth misunderstanding. Together, These performers give the film its essential social texture. The flock feels affectionate without becoming harmonious, and the village feels welcoming without becoming trustworthy. That tension keeps the mystery alive while allowing the comedy to emerge naturally from personality rather than random animal chaos. But voices and performances can only convince us so far. The production still had to build a physical world where digitally created sheep, isolated farmland, eccentric costumes, and a storybook English village could occupy the same believable reality, and that world is filled with design choices hiding in plain sight. George Hardy's Airstream trailer may be the most important object in The Sheep Detectives. It gleams against the open countryside like something dropped from another world. Modern yet nostalgic, protective yet exposed. George sits outside it reading mystery novels to his flock while sunset reflects across the curved metal, transforming an ordinary shepherd's routine into a private ceremony. Production designer Susie Davies does not merely give George somewhere to live. She builds a visual explanation for him. The trailer is mobile, but he has stopped moving. It offers shelter without roots, perfectly suited to a man who loves deeply while keeping the human world at a distance. Director Kyle Balda wanted the setting to feel believable without belonging too precisely to one decade. Davies, whose recent production design credits include Saltburn and Conclave, helped create that quality through careful detail rather than obvious fantasy decoration. George's farm was filmed at White Pond Farm, a location Balda valued because the horizon contains almost no visible settlement. Civilization appears to have withdrawn. Beyond the fields sits the small community of Dunbrook, but George's home remains physically and emotionally separate from it. He has chosen sheep, books, and open space over the complications waiting in town. That isolation allows the farm to function almost like the flock's childhood home. The landscape appears spacious, warm, and safe while George is alive. Grass rolls toward the horizon. Golden light catches the trailer. The sheep gather around their shepherd without fences dominating the frame. Then George dies, and the same environment changes meaning. Openness becomes vulnerability. Distance from town becomes danger. The design itself has not necessarily altered, but the audience's relationship to it has. That is disciplined visual storytelling. The set does not tell us what to feel. It waits for the story to contaminate everything that once looked comforting. Davies and Balda also needed to balance two competing tones. The story contains murder, inheritance disputes, an abattoir, and a prolonged night sequence. Yet it cannot lose the pastoral innocence that makes the sheep's perspective emotionally convincing. Balda described the design strategy as a deliberate contrast between darkness and beautiful natural color, with locations and costumes helping maintain that equilibrium. The film does not coat every threatening scene in gothic gloom. Instead, danger enters a world already established as inviting. A cheerful village can conceal greed. A lovely field can lead toward slaughter. Coziness becomes camouflage. Dunbrook operates as a classic mystery village filtered through family film warmth. Its human spaces feel organized enough to suggest community, but eccentric enough to make almost anyone a plausible suspect. Offices, domestic interiors, and public gathering places carry different social temperatures, allowing the sheep's investigation to move through environments they only partly understand. To them, human objects are clues without instructions. Documents, clothing, and household arrangements possess meanings the flock must interpret from the outside. The production design supports the central joke without announcing it. Human civilization looks perfectly ordinary to us, and completely bizarre from ground level. Rosa Diaz's costume design extends that character logic, especially through Lydia Harbottle. Emma Thompson described Lydia's sharply cut suits as closer to architecture than clothing. Their tailoring creates authority before she speaks, building a controlled silhouette that seems almost impossible to disrupt. Yet the suits use bright, approachable colors rather than severe blacks or grays. Lydia wants command without appearing openly hostile, power dressed as friendliness. Thompson used that contradiction to shape a lawyer who can dominate a room while presenting herself as its calmest, most reasonable person. The remaining costumes help separate Dunbrook's competing social worlds. George's practical appearance belongs to the land. Tim's police uniform often appears to possess more authority than the man wearing it. Rebecca's contemporary clothing immediately distinguishes her from the rural environment and the version of George preserved by the flock. These choices do not require loud symbolism. They create readable silhouettes, which becomes especially important in a crowded ensemble mystery where suspects must register quickly. Before dialogue explains occupation, status, or temperament, fabric and shape have already begun the introduction. The sheep required their own form of design, even though they wear nothing at all. Framestore created a flock spanning different breeds and ages, with some characters based directly on real sheep varieties and others assembled from traits found across several breeds. Production visual effects supervisor Graham Page visited farms around the United Kingdom, searching for animals whose physical characteristics could inform individual personalities. The goal was differentiation without cartoon distortion. Sebastian's imposing presence, Mopple's softness, and Lily's alertness needed to emerge through breed, scale, fleece, and posture rather than hats, glasses, or human accessories. That restraint makes the creature design unusually persuasive. Millions of digital wool strands were shaped to reproduce the twists and curls of real fleece, while animators kept the bodies anatomically grounded. These sheep cannot point with fingers, raise eyebrows like humans, or suddenly stand upright for a gag. Personality must travel through smaller signals: the angle of a head, the rhythm of a step, the compression of a flock when fear spreads through it. The physical design creates limitations, and those limitations force more inventive acting. Realism is not the enemy of expression here. It is the pressure that produces it. The live-action set also needed practical substitutes for characters that would not exist until months later. Actors rehearsed with articulated puppets, precisely designed stuffed sheep, and life-sized cardboard references that established the correct eye lines. After those rehearsals, the stand-ins could be removed for clean visual effects plates, leaving performers to reproduce their movements opposite empty space. These objects were temporary and largely invisible in the finished film, yet they formed a bridge between the physical set and Framestore's digital flock. Production design usually builds what audiences see. Here, it also built what the actors needed to imagine. Davies's environments, Dias's costumes, and Framestore's creature concepts all serve the same governing idea. Whimsy must grow from a world that feels touchable. The farm has weather. The trailer has weight. Lydia's suits have structure. The sheep have breed-specific bodies and wool that reacts like material rather than decoration. That solidity allows the story's stranger elements to feel emotionally normal. But physical design only establishes the pieces. George Steele's cinematography still had to decide where the camera would stand, how low it would move, and whether this mystery should be seen through human eyes or from somewhere much closer to the grass. The camera in The Sheep Detectives does something deceptively simple. It takes the sheep seriously. Cinematographer George Steele does not photograph the flock as decoration sitting beneath the human story. He brings the lens down toward their height, allowing furniture to loom, doorways to become barriers, and ordinary human spaces to feel enormous. From that level, Denbrook stops being a cozy village and becomes unexplored territory. A hotel corridor can resemble a maze. A field can stretch toward infinity. The visual joke is immediate, but the deeper effect matters more. We are not watching humans who happen to own sheep. We are entering a world interpreted by sheep. Steele shot the film using Sony Venice 2 cameras paired with Panavision Ultra Panatar 2 lenses. The Venice 2's full-frame sensor and broad dynamic range made it suitable for a production moving between bright countryside, shadowed interiors, and effects-heavy night sequences. The Ultra Panatar 2 lenses provide an anamorphic character, that subtly stretched, cinematic quality associated with widescreen photography, while maintaining the consistency required for complex visual effects work. Their controlled distortion and resolution allowed Framestore to place digital animals into the image without making the live-action photography feel clinically perfect. The frame remains polished, but it has texture. That balance between charm and technical control defines Steele's work. The countryside is photographed with enough warmth to explain why George withdrew into it, yet the imagery never becomes a tourism advertisement. Hills and open fields are beautiful, but they also isolate the characters. The horizon seems expansive until the investigation begins. Then the surrounding valley starts resembling a natural wall. Balda described the story as a variation on a locked room mystery, requiring the farm and village to feel enclosed while remaining geographically understandable. The camera therefore keeps returning to pathways, slopes, and connecting roads, quietly teaching us how the locations fit together before suspense begins tightening the space. This geographical clarity is crucial because the sheep cannot understand the human world in conventional terms. They navigate through smell, memory, and partial observation, so the camera often gives physical space greater importance than spoken explanation. A doorway tells us where escape is possible. A fence establishes who belongs inside. A human figure seen from below carries authority before saying anything. Steele uses composition to preserve the flock's limited knowledge. The audience may recognize the purpose of an object or room immediately, but the framing encourages us to experience the animal's uncertainty before translating it through our own understanding. Here, perspective is not a novelty. It is the mystery's operating system. Balda's animation background made this visual precision possible. He storyboarded the entire feature and assembled a full animatic, including scenes without digital sheep. Location footage recorded during preparation was sent to storyboard artists, who placed planned action directly over the real environments. This gave Steele, the assistant director, and the effects departments a common map while still leaving room for discoveries on set. It is an animation-heavy method applied to live action. Decide where the eye should travel, test the rhythm, then build the physical shot around that intention. Framestore's technical visualization pushed that preparation further. Before filming, artists tested whether complicated camera moves were physically achievable with equipment such as the Techno Dolly, a programmable crane capable of repeating precise movements. That repeatability matters when a shot contains performers, practical objects, and animals that will be added months later. The camera cannot wander casually and expect visual effects artists to repair every inconsistency. Each move must account for an invisible body occupying the frame, its height, speed, eye line, and interaction with the environment. Almost 1,000 effects shots were completed across Framestore teams in London, Montreal, Melbourne, and Mumbai. The abattoir sequence shows the method at its most expressive. Lily and Mopple enter a neighboring field, encounter another flock, and discover a place whose meaning is horrifying even before they fully understand it. The sequence gradually changes its camera language. Open compositions become crowded. Fog reduces visibility. Unfamiliar sheep appear within the frame like shapes emerging from a nightmare. When the chase begins, movement becomes sharper and more urgent, but the geography remains readable enough for fear to build rather than dissolve into confusion. Framestore adjusted herd density, atmospheric conditions, and character placement during pre-visualization, using those choices to raise the threat level before a single finished sheep existed. Then Sebastian arrives, and the sequence changes again. His confrontation with the sheepdogs begins as physical danger, but ends in sadness, requiring the camera to move from action grammar into emotional observation. Fast staging alone would have made the rescue exciting and disposable. Instead, the framing allows Sebastian's history to surface through posture, distance, and the way other characters look toward him. The spectacle pauses long enough for pain to enter. This is where Balda and Steele avoid a common hybrid film mistake. They do not assume visual effects complexity is automatically visual storytelling. A difficult shot only matters when the camera knows what the audience should feel inside it. The digital characters themselves required one carefully calculated break from realism. Actual sheep have eyes positioned towards the sides of their heads because they are prey animals. Framestore shifted the hero's eyes slightly forward, giving the camera clearer access to their gaze and allowing audiences to read emotional reactions. Push that adjustment further, and the characters become cartoons. Keep complete anatomical accuracy, and their faces risk becoming blank. The finished design occupies the narrow space between recognition and reality, supported by camera angles that reveal emotion without demanding human-style facial acting. Interaction shots presented another challenge. When Mopple crashes through the hotel with a pillowcase covering his head, every collision must connect a digital body to practical furniture. Objects touched by the sheep often require digital replacements, cloth simulation, or invisible transitions between real and computer-generated props. The same principle shaped Reggie and Ronnie's attack on a car. Pre-visualization allowed the practical effects crew to prepare a windscreen that would crack correctly on impact, while the animated ram supplied the force. The comedy feels spontaneous because the engineering is anything but. Steele's cinematography succeeds because it never asks the audience to admire the machinery. The cameras, anamorphic lenses, programmable cranes, digital wool, and simulated props disappear into a coherent point of view. We feel small when the sheep feel small. We understand the landscape when they begin understanding it. And when darkness closes around them, the same fields that once promised safety become unfamiliar. What the eyes receive, however, is only half of that transformation. Christoph Beck's score and the film's layered soundscape must supply the invisible emotion. The bleeding humans hear, the conversations audiences understand, and the silence left behind by George. The most important sound in The Sheep Detectives is not music. It is the difference between a voice and a bleat. When the story enters the flock's perspective, Lily, Mopple, and the others speak with complete clarity. Their arguments have rhythm, personality, and emotional subtext. When humans listen, that intelligence collapses into ordinary animal noise. The joke works instantly, but the idea underneath it is painful. These sheep have thoughts, memories, and love that George can never fully hear. Sound, therefore, creates the film's central boundary. The audience is invited across it. The human characters remain outside. Christoph Beck's score has to keep that boundary emotionally open without making the film feel divided between cartoon comedy and live-action murder mystery. Beck was an experienced choice for exactly this problem. His career has moved comfortably between the emotional sweep of Frozen, the playful caper rhythms of Ant-Man, and the eccentric supernatural textures of WandaVision. Here, he writes music capable of changing tone within seconds. Curiosity becomes danger. Danger releases into physical comedy. Comedy suddenly exposes grief. The transitions feel smooth because Beck treats those emotions as parts of the same story rather than separate genres competing for control. The soundtrack contains 17 cues running roughly 47 minutes, beginning with One Secret to Happiness, and closing with Every Sheep Should Have a Name. Those titles alone trace the film's emotional path: happiness, death, motive, pursuit, memory, and finally recognition. The album was released on May 8, 2026, alongside the film. Beck's music was orchestrated and conducted by Tim Davies, recorded at Air Studios Lyndhurst Hall, and recorded and mixed by Casey Stone. That traditional orchestral foundation gives the adventure size without making it feel synthetic or disposable. These may be sheep detectives, but the orchestra never laughs at them. Beck reportedly constructed the score around three principal ideas: music associated with George, a theme for Lily, and a broader family motif representing the flock. That structure gives the score an emotional map. George's theme does not simply identify a character. After his death, it identifies absence. When its warmth returns, the melody functions like memory, entering the room before anyone mentions him. Lily's material carries more forward movement, matching a character who believes thinking harder will restore order. The flock theme widens the emotional frame. This is not only Lily's investigation. It is a family trying to decide what it will become after losing its center. The instrumentation keeps that orchestral language close to the earth. A solo viola and prepared piano repeatedly add a rougher folk texture, with the piano strings dampened to produce a dry, percussive knock rather than a clean concert hall note. You can hear the logic. Polished mystery music would make the sheep seem too sophisticated, while purely rustic music would deny the story's danger. Beck combines both. Strings can dance through a deduction, then that blunt piano sound brings the music back to hooves, soil, and physical movement. It is pastoral without becoming decorative. Clever, but still muddy around the edges. Sheeplechase and the extended run demonstrate Beck's comic action instincts. Fast strings, lively woodwinds, accordion coloring, and heavier brass transform awkward animal movement into genuine momentum. The music does not pretend the sheep move like conventional action heroes. It builds excitement around the physical reality of their bodies, the rush of a flock, the panic of changing direction, and the comic danger of too much wool arriving at once. The Denbrook Poisoner pushes the family motif into a mock military register, using brass and snare-driven energy to make the flock's determination sound heroic and faintly ridiculous. Both readings are true. That is the pleasure. The score becomes more affecting when it stops moving. You'll be okay. What a carnival is, and especially remembering Hert's return to the emotional material connected with George. Beck resists drowning those moments in sentimental volume. The melodies open up, the rhythmic machinery falls away, and the orchestration gives individual lines room to breathe. Grief sounds less like an explosion than an interruption. A familiar theme arrives, but the person attached to it does not. This is where the film earns its tenderness. The same score that made a sheep chase feel like an adventure now reminds us why the flock started running in the first place. Sound effects carry the comedy at ground level. Hooves striking wood, wool brushing narrow surfaces, objects shifting under an animal's weight, and the collective noise of a startled flock give the digital characters physical presence. The best effects are not loud, they are specific. A hoof cannot grasp like a hand, so every attempted interaction needs friction, scraping, and imbalance. Those sounds support the visual rule that these characters remain anatomically sheep. They also create comic timing. A pause, a cautious step, then impact. The joke lands in the ear a fraction before the reaction arrives on screen. Silence matters just as much. George begins the story by reading aloud, filling the pasture with a human voice the sheep understand even though he cannot understand theirs. After his death, that ritual disappears. The resulting quiet is not empty. It is the shape of someone missing. Beck's score enters that space carefully, while natural sounds, the field, wind, distant movement, and nervous bleating, make the flock appear suddenly exposed. By the finale, Very Good Detectives and Every Sheep Should Have a Name bring the major themes together, allowing investigation, family, and remembrance to occupy the same musical conclusion. The audio design ultimately performs the film's most generous act. It lets us hear lives the human characters overlook. Every voice belongs to a distinct consciousness. Every returning melody insists that memory has value. Every ordinary bleat carries meaning someone nearby cannot receive. Yet producing that illusion required far more than a recording booth and an orchestra. Actors performed opposite empty spaces. Technicians coordinated hundreds of effects shots, and an animation-trained director had to reshape his methods around a live-action set. The finished film sounds effortless. Its production journey was anything but. The most revealing behind-the-scenes image from The Sheep Detectives shows Hugh Jackman bottle-feeding a plastic lamb, not a trained animal, not even an articulated puppet capable of returning his gaze. Just a practical stand-in waiting to become a living creature months later. That single image captures the production's central challenge. Actors had to create believable relationships with characters who did not yet exist, while every technical department had to plan around bodies the camera could not see. The finished film presents George and his flock as an effortless family. On set, that intimacy depended upon preparation, imagination, and an enormous amount of carefully organized emptiness. The project entered its physical production phase in the United Kingdom during 2024, with industry reporting confirming it was underway by late June and using Amazon MGM's production presence at Shepperton Studios. Location work spread across the English countryside, while the farm and village environments gave the mystery its enclosed pastoral geography. Exact daily schedules have not been widely published, so the most useful production story lies less in how many days were spent filming than in how radically the shoot differed from an ordinary live-action feature. Kyle Balda was directing human actors, invisible animated performers, practical effects, and future digital environments simultaneously. Balda approached that problem by importing the discipline of animation into live action. He storyboarded the entire movie and constructed a feature-length animatic, including sequences that contained no sheep. Before arriving on location, the team could already see the intended staging, rhythm, and camera relationships. Balda then recorded videos of real locations on his phone and sent them to storyboard artists, who incorporated the actual landscapes into revised boards. The plan was detailed, but not rigid. It gave the crew a shared version of the movie they could deviate from when better ideas emerged, rather than forcing everyone to guess what an invisible flock might eventually be doing. That method proved essential for the actors. Nicholas Braun and Molly Gordon worked with purpose-built stuffed versions of the sheep, puppets, tennis ball references, and life-sized cardboard cutouts positioned at the proper eye level. Gordon recalled that after briefly holding a lamb during camera tests, much of her actual performance involved standing in the landscape and acting toward nothing. Braun faced the equally strange task of maintaining eye contact with an imaginary animal whose final expressions would be designed in post-production. Their surprise upon seeing the completed film says everything. They had performed one version of each scene, while Framestore later revealed the fully populated version hiding inside it. Using real sheep for the principal performances was considered impractical almost immediately. When animals were brought into the production office, they wandered, lowered their heads, and concentrated on eating. Balda joked that the experience confirmed the decision to animate them, while cinematographer George Steele compared their constant motion to a boxer refusing to remain still. That unpredictability might produce charming documentary footage, but it is disastrous when a mystery scene requires precise eye lines, dialogue timing, and repeated camera moves. A sheep cannot be asked to hit an emotional beat on take 6. Digital performers could. Real animals remained crucial as reference. Production visual effects supervisor Graham Page traveled to farms across Britain, searching for breeds and temperaments that could inform the heroes. At Miller's Ark Petting Farm, the team established a scanning booth and captured animals, including the Shetland ewe, who inspired Lily, and a Border Leicester, used as Cloud's counterpart. Approximately 50 sheep of different breeds and ages were scanned. One merino named Sam contributed the gentle walking rhythm used when Mopple emerges from the chaotic hotel sequence. The animators were not inventing generic sheep movement. They were borrowing specific behavior from individual animals. Framestore then expanded that research into almost 1,000 visual effects shots produced across London, Montreal, Melbourne, and Mumbai. The artists started with a shared underlying sheep model, adapting anatomy, fleece, and scale while retaining a consistent muscular rig beneath the wool. That system allowed animators to move efficiently between characters and helped crowd scenes remain coherent. The global structure was not simply a way to divide workload. Different teams contributed creature development, animation, simulation, and compositing to performances that still needed to feel as though they belonged to one flock standing in one English field. Pre-visualization became the meeting place between digital invention and practical craftsmanship. For the sequence in which Reggie and Ronnie attack a car, the filmmakers decided during previs that the windscreen should crack under the ram's impact. The special effects crew could then prepare the glass so it fractured correctly without collapsing out of the frame. The sheep remained digital, but the damage was physically engineered. That hybrid approach gives the scene weight. A fully computer-generated car attack might have been easier to control, yet the real glass reacting inside a photographed environment makes the absurdity feel satisfyingly dangerous. Mopple's hotel rampage was even more complicated. A sheep charges through furniture with a pillowcase over his head, forcing the effects team to connect a digital animal with practical objects, simulated fabric, and photographed destruction. Everything touched by the flock potentially required a digital replacement or an invisible transition between real and computer-generated material. To understand the physical chaos, Framestore animators recorded themselves moving around their homes on all fours and crashing into furniture. Somewhere inside Mopple's polished comic performance are grown visual effects artists crawling into tables for reference. Ridiculous? Completely. Useful? Absolutely. The darker abattoir sequence required a different kind of coordination. Previous artists adjusted fog density, flock size, and the timing with which unfamiliar sheep entered the frame, using atmosphere to increase danger before filming. Sebastian's fight with the sheepdogs then had to pivot from action into sadness, so the camera language was designed around an emotional transition rather than spectacle alone. Framestore also developed an internal cloning tool that could quickly enlarge or reduce digital crowds and offset walking cycles, preventing every sheep from moving in artificial synchronization. Technical flexibility became storytelling flexibility. What makes this production journey memorable is the absence of a single heroic solution. No clever device suddenly made the sheep real. The illusion emerged from hundreds of linked decisions. Balda's animatic, Steele's repeatable camera moves, the actors' cardboard eye lines, farmers providing reference animals, practical crews preparing breakaway glass, and animators studying themselves colliding with furniture. Balda has emphasized that the final performances were human-driven, shaped by artists rather than generated automatically. That labor disappears into the finished image, exactly as it should. The flock feels alive because an international crew worried about every hoof, curl of wool, and nervous glance. The remaining question is whether audiences rewarded that effort, and the film's commercial journey would prove considerably less comfortable than the warmth visible on screen. The Sheep Detectives did not become a runaway blockbuster. It achieved something more complicated, a soft opening followed by the kind of staying power that suggests audiences genuinely liked what they discovered. Released domestically by Amazon MGM Studios on May 8, 2026, the film earned $15,087,796 from 3,457 theaters during its first weekend, placing fourth. That is respectable for a family mystery built around an unfamiliar title, but modest for a production carrying extensive visual effects and a cast filled with recognizable names. The sheep arrived quietly. Then they refused to leave. The release date placed the film in a crowded marketplace. The Devil Wears Prada 2 and the Michael Jackson biographical drama Michael were already drawing large audiences, while Mortal Kombat 2 opened directly against it. Instead of dominating one demographic, the Sheep Detectives had to persuade families that a story beginning with a shepherd's death could still provide comforting entertainment. Its $15.1 million debut landed within pre-release projections, which had generally placed the opening between $12 million and $15 million. The number was not a shock. What happened afterward was more revealing. During its second weekend, the film earned another $9,574,847, declining only 37%. That hold looks especially healthy beside Mortal Kombat 2, which fell 65% during the same frame. 1 week later, the Sheep Detectives dropped by just 4%, collecting $9.2 million over the Memorial Day period and bringing its domestic total to $43.7 million. This is where the film's commercial story changes. It was never powered by urgency or franchise anticipation. It survived through recommendation, family attendance, and viewers choosing it after the louder releases had already captured opening weekend attention. The numbers calculates a domestic multiplier of 438, meaning the final North American gross was more than 4 times the opening weekend. That is an unusually leggy result for a wide studio release. Only 22.8% of the domestic total came from its debut, confirming that the theatrical run depended far more on sustained interest than immediate demand. The film eventually reached 66,078,506 outs domestically and remained in American theaters for at least 10 weekends, still earning money from 85 locations in mid-July. Not explosive, persistent. And persistence is often the clearest financial evidence of positive audience response. International audiences contributed almost exactly the same amount. Current reporting places the overseas total at approximately $65.5 million, producing a worldwide theatrical gross of about $131.6 million. That near-even split is appropriate for a British-American production whose countryside setting, cozy mystery tone, and internationally familiar cast travel more easily than aggressively American humor might. The United Kingdom and Ireland provided a particularly supportive market, where the film opened in third place and remained inside the top 10 6 weeks later. Its commercial appeal was not concentrated in one country. It accumulated gradually across several territories. Whether that worldwide total made the film profitable is less comforting. The numbers lists a production budget of $75 million, putting theatrical revenue at roughly 1.8 times that figure. But studios do not keep every dollar sold at the ticket counter. Cinemas retain a substantial share, while marketing and distribution expenses sit outside the reported production budget. A pre-release Forbes analysis calculated that the film needed at least $128, $6 million worldwide merely to recover its known production spending through theatrical rentals, and stressed that this minimum excluded later post-production and marketing costs. The final gross crossed that bare threshold, but not by enough to establish a clean theatrical profit. The useful word here is not flop. It is borderline. The film performed too well to be dismissed as a commercial rejection, particularly after its strong holds, but its expensive digital flock prevented $131 million from becoming an uncomplicated triumph. A cheaper version of this movie would look like a substantial success. At $75 million, every realistic curl of wool raised the financial stakes. The same technical ambition that made the sheep believable also narrowed the path toward profitability. Craft and commerce pulled against each other. Amazon's ownership changes the calculation further. The film received a digital release through Prime Video on June 24, 2026, giving it a second life within the company's subscription ecosystem shortly after its theatrical run began winding down. Public streaming listings confirmed that it was available on the service by July, but Amazon has not released enough title-specific financial data to determine how many subscriptions, renewed memberships, or viewing hours can be attributed directly to the movie. Streaming value exists here. Measuring it precisely does not. That uncertainty may ultimately favor the sheep detectives. Family films can generate value through repeated home viewing long after theatrical reporting stops, and the story's mixture of animals, mystery, and emotional reassurance gives it a stronger afterlife than its opening weekend suggested. The commercial verdict, then, is neither disaster nor breakout. A modest launch, impressive endurance, balanced international appeal, and a final theatrical total that approached viability without guaranteeing profit. Audiences slowly found the flock. Critics found it much faster, and their enthusiastic response would create an unusual contrast between the film's financial caution and its remarkably warm cultural reception. Critics approached The Sheep Detectives expecting a punchline. Many left talking about death. That gap between expectation and experience became the film's strongest critical advantage. A title this openly ridiculous prepares audiences for disposable talking animal comedy, yet Kyle Balda and Craig Mazin deliver something gentler, stranger, and far more emotionally alert. As of August 6, 2026, the film holds a 95% tomatometer score from 205 reviews and a 96% verified audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Metacritic is more measured but still positive, recording a score of 72 from 37 critics and a 7.6 user rating. Critics and audiences did not split over this one. They largely met in the same pasture. The recurring word across positive reviews was not hilarious. It was earnest. Critics admired the film for refusing to treat younger viewers as emotionally fragile or intellectually passive. Rotten Tomatoes consensus praised its combination of dry humor, sweetness, and unexpectedly profound themes, while several reviewers compared its direct handling of mortality to the best family storytelling rather than the safest. The film tells children that death hurts. Memory can be unreliable, and loving someone does not mean knowing everything about them. Then it trusts them to remain seated. That confidence became more distinctive than any sheep-related joke. Comparisons to Babe were inevitable, and almost every major response reached for them. Both films place digitally assisted farm animals inside a world that recognizes danger, separation, and death. Both understand that cuteness becomes more powerful when it is not protected from sadness. Yet The Sheep Detectives is less interested in proving an animal's usefulness than in exploring how innocence processes loss. The Guardian placed it somewhere between Babe, Cozy Crime, and Watership Down, praising the way it moves beyond George's death without allowing shock to smother the adventure. That tonal escape act impressed critics even when they remained skeptical of digital talking animals. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Chris O'Dowd, and Bryan Cranston received much of the performance praise. Reviewers responded to the way the voice actors gave Lily, Mopple, and Sebastian emotional identities without turning them into loud cartoon mascots. Lily's intelligence is constantly challenged by experience. Mopple's gentleness conceals difficult memory. Sebastian's severity gradually becomes wounded vulnerability. Critics also admired the visual effects work because the sheep possess enough physical tangibility to make their feelings credible within live action. Their wool shifts. Their bodies occupy space. Their limitations remain visible. The movie asks us to recognize human emotion without pretending these characters are miniature people wearing fleece. The screenplay's treatment of grief became the true center of the conversation. Several critics recognize that the investigation is almost secondary to the flock's attempt to understand what being dead actually means. Solving the crime cannot return George. Identifying a motive cannot restore the evening ritual of hearing him read. The sheep initially approach death as a mystery story event, something followed by clues, revelations, and order, but discover that emotional consequences do not end when the culprit is named. That idea gave the film unusual weight for mainstream family entertainment. It also explains why adults responded so strongly. The animal's confusion resembles the way people intellectualize grief when feeling it directly becomes unbearable. The praise was substantial, but hardly unanimous in detail. Even supportive critics identified a weaker film whenever the story leaves the flock and settles among the humans. The village investigation sometimes follows familiar cozy mystery patterns, and several suspects receive too little development to generate genuine uncertainty. The sheep remain emotionally specific. Some humans become functions: journalist, lawyer, butcher, rival farmer, potential killer. Guy Lodge's assessment, summarized by Entertainment Weekly, argued that the film is most pleasurable when the sheep control the narrative and less assured when attention shifts toward village business. That criticism lands because the central animals are not merely the movie's novelty. They are its richest characters. Nicholas Braun became the most divisive performer. Some reviewers enjoyed his hesitant English policeman and found the accent convincing enough, while others heard an actor wrestling visibly with pronunciation and repeating familiar awkward mannerisms. His relationship with Molly Gordon also attracted criticism for lacking romantic chemistry, though the film arguably benefits from keeping their connection uneasy. Emma Thompson and Hong Chau inspired a different complaint. Both are entertaining enough to expose how little material they receive. Thompson can reshape an entire scene with one controlled insult, then disappear before Lydia becomes more than a sharply dressed source of comic authority. A smaller group of critics rejected the visual illusion itself. One prominently aggregated negative response argued that the digital creatures never interact convincingly with the human cast, while mixed reviews found the mystery conventional, the tenderness excessive, or the humor milder than its premise promised. Metacritic's distribution reflects that hesitation. 68% of its counted reviews were positive and 32% mixed, with none classified as fully negative. The film inspired reservations rather than hostility. Even many skeptics acknowledged the originality of the premise, the warmth of the atmosphere, or the effectiveness of the final emotional turn. Audience response proved even more unified. Rotten Tomatoes lists a 96% verified score from more than 20,500 ratings, while Metacritic reports that 81% of its user ratings were positive. Viewer comments repeatedly emphasized that adults and children could enjoy the same film without receiving separate layers of pandering humor. That alignment helps explain the strong theatrical legs discussed earlier. People did not merely tolerate the sheep because they needed family entertainment. They recommended them. The cultural response has not produced a massive controversy, viral dance, or endlessly repeated meme. Its impact is quieter. The film became a pleasant surprise and a reminder that family cinema can acknowledge mortality without surrendering warmth. It arrived looking like a novelty and left critics discussing mindfulness, remembrance, and the emotional intelligence of sheep. Award season recognition remains too early to judge in August 2026, particularly for visual effects, score, and voice performance. Its more meaningful achievement is already visible. Audiences stopped laughing at the title long enough to care about what it meant. And that brings the analysis to its final question, not whether the flock solved George's murder, but what their investigation says about grief, identity, community, and the courage required to remember. The film's ending, and everything discussed from here, contains major spoilers. The Sheep Detectives begins with a murder, but its deepest mystery is far more difficult. What does death mean to a creature that has never learned how to imagine permanent absence? Lily believes the answer can be reached through investigation. Find the clues, identify the killer, restore the order promised by George's detective novels. Yet Craig Mazin's screenplay slowly dismantles that comforting structure. Solving George's death does not bring him home. Justice may organize the facts, but it cannot repair the empty space beside his trailer. The flock discovers that grief is not a puzzle with a final page. It is knowledge they must learn to carry. Memory becomes the film's answer to that burden, though not in the sentimental form audiences might expect. The sheep have evolved to forget frightening experiences, a survival mechanism that keeps terror from paralyzing the flock. Forgetting protects them. It also threatens to erase George. Mopple's exceptional memory therefore feels like both a gift and an injury. He retains details the others lose, but remembering forces him to experience pain repeatedly. The film refuses to label either response as weakness. Forgetting allows life to continue. Remembering gives life continuity. Maturity arrives when the flock stops treating those instincts as opposites and understands that survival without memory becomes emptiness, while memory without movement becomes imprisonment. George himself exists inside that conflict. The sheep remember a patient guardian who reads stories aloud and recognize their individual personalities. Rebecca remembers a father whose emotional availability was far less dependable. The investigation does not prove one version false. It reveals that love can be genuine and incomplete at the same time. George was capable of giving tenderness to his flock while failing the people closest to him. Hugh Jackman's warmth initially encourages us to idealize the character, then Rebecca's anger punctures that idealization without destroying it. That complexity is unusually honest for family cinema. Dead characters are often polished into saints. George remains loved, flawed, and unreachable. Names carry similar weight. The closing idea that every sheep should have a name might sound like a harmless statement about individuality, but it quietly overturns the human assumptions governing the story. To many people in Denbrook, sheep are property, inventory, or meat. Naming them means recognizing that each possesses a distinct inner life. Lily is not interchangeable with Cloud. Mopple's memories belong to Mopple. Sebastian's trauma cannot be reduced to the behavior of an aggressive animal. The audience understands their conversations, but the film's ethical challenge is broader. Can we respect a consciousness even when we cannot hear its language? The sheep do not become worthy because they solved the case. Solving the case forces humans to notice the worth that was already there. That idea extends to Officer Tim Derry. Tim begins as another person nobody truly hears. His uniform signals authority, yet his hesitation makes villagers dismiss him before he finishes speaking. The sheep possess intelligence without recognized status. Tim possesses recognized status without confidence. Their accidental partnership allows both sides to become visible. Tim learns to observe instead of performing competence, while the flock learns that not every human institution is automatically hostile. The alliance never becomes completely tidy, and that helps. Community is not presented as perfect mutual understanding. It begins when different kinds of outsiders decide that misunderstanding is not an excuse to stop listening. The murder solution is less satisfying than the emotional investigation surrounding it. The revelation involving George's estranged son, concealed identity, and inheritance delivers the required machinery of a cozy whodunit, complete with planted motives and redirected suspicion. It works. It does not haunt. Several human suspects remain too thinly developed for the culprit's exposure to generate the shock associated with the best mysteries. The screenplay's priorities are obvious. The killer matters because the sheep need truth, not because the villain becomes an unforgettable psychological creation. Viewers seeking an intricate Agatha Christie-style puzzle may find the mechanics modest. Viewers following Lily's emotional education will find the resolution considerably richer. That imbalance defines the film's major weakness. Whenever attention remains with the flock, the sheep detectives feels specific, emotionally curious, and unlike most studio family entertainment. Whenever it shifts toward broad village eccentricity, an uncertain romantic subplot, or lightly sketched suspects, it becomes more conventional. Emma Thompson and Hong Shao create characters who suggest entire unseen histories, only to receive limited room for development. Nicholas Braun's awkwardness is sympathetic, but sometimes overly familiar. The tonal control survives these detours, yet the human material rarely matches the personality or thematic clarity found among the digital animals. Still, the film's strengths are substantial. Kyle Balda translates his animation instincts into live action without letting technique overwhelm emotion. Framestore gives the sheep physical weight while preserving their animal nature. Christoph Beck's music treats their grief seriously. Julia Louis-Dreyfus builds Lily from certainty, fear, and resilience without relying on vocal gimmicks. Most importantly, Mazin does not use death as temporary motivation before returning everyone to uncomplicated happiness. The loss remains. The flock moves forward anyway. Contemporary discussion has recognized that unusual willingness to give children a safe fictional space for confronting mortality, while the film's strong critical and audience scores suggest viewers responded to being trusted rather than protected from every difficult feeling. Its long-term legacy cannot be declared only 3 months after release. Theatrically, the film achieved impressive staying power without becoming a giant financial success. Its roughly $15.1 million domestic opening eventually grew to about $66.1 million, part of a worldwide total near $131. $6 million against a reported $75 million production budget. Those numbers make the commercial outcome complicated, but they also prove the film traveled through recommendation rather than opening weekend frenzy. Its likeliest future is not franchise domination. It is gradual affection, the kind of family movie discovered on streaming, revisited after personal loss, and remembered more warmly each time. For viewers wanting rapid jokes or a difficult murder puzzle, the film may feel too gentle. For families willing to discuss death, memory, and the imperfections of people we love, it offers something rare. I would rate The Sheep Detectives 8 out of 10. Visually persuasive, emotionally intelligent, and occasionally constrained by a human storyline less interesting than its flock. Its final wisdom is simple without being shallow. Stories cannot prevent pain. Detectives cannot reverse death. Memory cannot preserve anyone perfectly. But telling stories, seeking truth, and calling someone by their name are ways of refusing to let love disappear without a trace. The sheep solve George's murder. More importantly, they learn how to remember him and continue living. That is the real case. And the film closes it beautifully. Adaptation is often described as translation, but The Sheep Detectives demonstrates why that description is too polite. Translation implies carrying the same meaning into a different language. Adaptation requires choosing which meanings survive and which must be sacrificed. Craig Mazin did not merely shorten Leonie Swan's 3 bags full or remove characters to fit a feature-length structure. He changed the answer to the central mystery. That is not cosmetic surgery. It alters the moral architecture of the entire story, reshaping George, the flock's investigation, and the emotional destination toward which every clue is moving. In Swan's novel, the sheep eventually learn that George took his own life. The film replaces that bleak revelation with a conventional murderer, Peter Van Vuren, allowing the investigation to end with a culprit who can be exposed and confronted. Mazin explained that the book's solution did not fit the all-ages film he was trying to create. Although he considered the sheep's innocence and growth more essential than preserving the exact mechanics of the mystery. He also combined characters from the novel's larger flock, reducing the number of personalities audiences needed to identify during a relatively fast-moving screen story. That change inevitably removes something powerful. The novel's conclusion denies the sheep the comforting logic of detective fiction. There is no external villain whose capture restores moral order. Their beloved shepherd becomes both victim and cause, forcing them to confront a truth more psychologically difficult than murder. The film's version is easier to organize. A killer can be pursued. Evidence can be interpreted. Innocent characters can be cleared. The emotional wound remains, but the narrative supplies someone to blame. For a mystery, that creates satisfaction. For an existential story about how little the sheep truly knew George, it reduces the cruelty and ambiguity. Yet calling the change cowardly would miss what Mazin gains. A family film beginning with murder is already asking young viewers to cross difficult emotional terrain. Keeping the novel's original revelation would shift the movie toward questions about despair, responsibility, and whether the flock's love could ever have reached George. Those questions deserve serious treatment, not a late twist squeezed between a comic chase and a reassuring finale. Mazin chooses a cleaner crime because the film's real darkness lies elsewhere. Sebastian dies, George remains gone, and Lily learns that solving a case cannot reverse either loss. The movie softens one truth while refusing to soften death itself. The alteration also changes George's relationship with Rebecca. In the film, her resentment can coexist with the discovery that her father was killed by someone else. George remains flawed, secretive, and emotionally inconsistent, but the story does not ask Rebecca to reinterpret his death as a final act of withdrawal. That keeps the father-daughter conflict focused on the life he lived rather than the manner in which he died. Hugh Jackman's warmth survives examination without becoming complete absolution. The sheep loved one version of George. Rebecca experienced another. Neither possesses the whole man. Combining sheep characters creates a different trade-off. Novels can pause for an internal observation, reintroduce a minor personality, and let readers build recognition across hundreds of pages. Film demands instant readability. Lily needs intellectual urgency. Mopple needs memory. Sebastian needs weight. Cloud, Zora, Sir Richfield, Reggie, and Ronnie each require a vocal or visual signature that registers immediately. Mazin's compression makes the flock easier to follow, but it also pushes some characters toward a single dominant trait. The result is efficient ensemble writing rather than the sprawling social portrait a novel can support. The adaptation's cleverest preservation is the sheep's innocence. They are not childish because they lack intelligence. They are innocent because their knowledge comes from stories whose structures are tidier than life. George has taught them how fictional mysteries behave without preparing them for the emotional consequences of a real one. Every adaptation decision circles that contradiction. The killer can change. Characters can merge. Events can be reordered. What cannot disappear is the distance between what the flock believes a mystery will give them and what the investigation actually takes away. That is why the film remains recognizably connected to Swan's premise even after making its largest departure. Fidelity is not always duplication. Sometimes it is protecting the emotional question beneath the plot. How do creatures who trust stories respond when reality refuses to behave like one? Mazin answers differently from the novel, and the film becomes less devastating because of it. It also becomes more accessible, more conventionally satisfying, and better equipped to begin conversations with younger audiences. The adaptation loses some darkness. It does not lose its soul. But the screenplay's changes only explain what the sheep experience. They do not fully explain why viewers accept these digital animals as thinking beings in the first place. That achievement comes from a more subtle manipulation. The film teaches us to project emotion onto bodies that never stop behaving like sheep. Extended Part 1315, 876 words, the film's most daring technical choice is also its most ethical one. The sheep never become human enough to make understanding them effortless. They do not stand upright when the plot becomes complicated. They do not put on detective costumes, operate machinery with convenient hooves, or transform their faces into rubbery cartoon masks. Kyle Balda insisted that they remain animals living within a human environment. Humans hear bleeding, while the audience hears language. Framestore studied extensive reference footage to find real physical gestures, a stomp, turn, or hesitant amble, that could communicate thought without breaking the creature's anatomy. That rule forces viewers to participate. Lily's voice tells us what she feels, but her body does not illustrate every line like a visual subtitle. We watch the angle of her head, the placement of her feet, and the tension spreading through the flock. Then we complete the performance ourselves. Balda has described this process as humans projecting emotion onto animal movement according to context. That projection is not a technical limitation hiding behind good dialogue. It is the film's entire emotional method. We recognize Lily because the filmmakers leave enough space for recognition to happen inside us. Framestore did bend reality in one decisive area. Real sheep have eyes positioned toward the sides of their heads, an anatomical advantage for prey animals watching for danger. The filmmakers moved the hero's eyes forward so audiences could read their gaze more easily. Everything depends on the degree of that adjustment. Too little, an emotional connection becomes difficult. Too much, and the flock resembles human celebrities wearing animal faces. The visual effects team scanned approximately 50 sheep of different breeds and ages, building character designs from real bodies before making this calculated break from authenticity. The compromise exposes something fascinating about cinematic empathy. Audiences often claim they need realism, but complete realism can create emotional distance. We need enough truth to believe the body and enough manipulation to access the mind. The sheep detectives lives inside that narrow space. Wool responds to weather. Hooves collide awkwardly with furniture. The flock compresses when frightened, yet the eyes meet the camera just clearly enough to produce the sensation that someone is looking back. Not an object, not livestock, someone. That distinction gives the comedy moral weight. Mopple charging blindly through a hotel is funny because his sheep body makes every human object inconvenient. Reggie and Ronnie attacking a car is funny because their solution emerges from ram behavior rather than action movie competence. The film never needs to humiliate the animals for failing to behave like people. It reverses the joke. Human civilization is badly designed for sheep, and the sheep possess enough determination to expose how absurd that design becomes from another creature's height. The same perspective transforms the abattoir sequence. For a human audience, the location has an obvious function. For Lily and Mopple, understanding arrives gradually through smell, atmosphere, terrified animals, and incomplete clues. The sequence refuses the safety of abstraction. The neighboring sheep are not background creatures who exist solely to frighten the heroes. They represent what happens when humans refuse to imagine an animal's interior life. Framestore used Previs to control fog, herd density, and camera language as the mood moved from suspense into Sebastian's tragic rescue, designing the technical escalation around an emotional transition rather than spectacle alone. The result does not turn the film into a direct argument against farming or animal ownership. George himself raises sheep, and the pasture remains a place of genuine affection. The movie's concern is recognition. George gives the animals names, reads to them, and notices their individual behavior. Other humans see a category. That contrast mirrors the way the audience is trained to watch. At first, the flock appears to be one woolly mass. Soon Lily, Mopple, Sebastian, and the others become impossible to confuse. Attention creates individuality. Children may be especially receptive to that process because the film does not begin by demanding an abstract discussion about consciousness or death. It begins with animals talking. The difficult ideas arrive after identification has already occurred. Reporting after the release found parents surprised by how clearly young viewers understood the themes of loss, remembrance, and honoring someone who had died. The film became a starting point for conversations that many adults struggle to initiate without a fictional structure supporting them. That is the purpose of the sheep becoming clouds idea. It provides Lily with a comforting picture before forcing her to understand that comfort is not the same as truth. Children's stories often use softened metaphors for death, But this film allows the metaphor to fail. Sebastian does not literally become a cloud. George does not return because the mystery has been solved. What survives is memory, not as magical resurrection, but as the influence a lost person leaves inside those who continue living. Balda called grief, loss, and the value of remembering the film's North Star, connecting the material to his own experience of losing someone when he was younger. He hoped the movie would help parents discuss emotions that can feel larger than children know how to handle. That personal investment explains why the filmmaking remains sincere even at its strangest. The sheep are not used to make grief cute. Their innocence removes the defensive language adults build around grief, letting the feeling arrive in a simpler and sometimes more painful form. The movie, therefore, succeeds as an experiment in perspective. It asks viewers to look downward, listen past the bleeding, and imagine an interior world hidden behind unfamiliar behavior. Once that invitation is accepted, the murder mystery becomes almost secondary. We care because these animals care. The technical illusion produces an emotional truth. Empathy begins when appearance stops being treated as evidence of emptiness. And that achievement may determine the film's future more than any single box office figure. The remaining question is whether The Sheep Detectives becomes the beginning of a series, a streaming-era family favorite, or simply one beautifully strange movie that knew when to leave the pasture. Extended Part 1415, 918 words, a sequel to The Sheep Detectives, would be easy to pitch. The flock has discovered a talent for investigation. Tim has finally acquired confidence. Denbrook contains enough eccentric residents to generate another crime before breakfast. Nicholas Braun has publicly expressed enthusiasm for returning, but as of August 6, 2026, no official sequel has been announced. That absence is neither surprising nor definitive. Studios usually wait for theatrical totals, streaming engagement, cast availability, and production cost projections before sending an expensive digital flock back into the field. The commercial argument is complicated. The movie earned approximately $131.9 million worldwide against a reported $75 million production budget. Its opening weekend supplied only 22.8% of its final domestic gross, resulting in a strong 4.38 multiplier. In plain language, it opened modestly and endured. Theatrical audiences kept discovering it for weeks, and Prime Video received the film on June 24, giving Amazon MGM another way to turn long-term family viewing into value. Those numbers do not guarantee theatrical profit, but they demonstrate affection more convincingly than a front-loaded opening followed by collapse. A second film could also cost less. The original production carried the burden of designing every hero sheep, establishing digital wool systems, refining rigs, scanning reference breeds, and discovering how those creatures should interact with photographed environments. Framestore's teams delivered almost 1,000 effects shots while creating tools for flock simulation and practical-to-digital object replacement. Much of that research could theoretically become reusable infrastructure. The models would still require improvements, new animation, and extensive rendering, but a sequel would not begin with an empty barn. Creatively, however, continuation creates danger. The first film is not powerful because sheep solve crimes. It is powerful because this particular investigation destroys their innocent understanding of death. Repeating the formula with another murdered human could turn grief into franchise branding. Sebastian's sacrifice would become emotional precedent. Lily's growth could reset so she can learn roughly the same lesson again. What once felt unexpectedly sincere might begin to resemble a machine. Pastoral murder, comic misunderstanding, digital chase, tearful remembrance, case closed. The smarter sequel would change the emotional problem rather than simply changing the victim. Lily no longer needs to learn that death is permanent. She could face the burden of leadership after becoming the flock's recognized detective. Mopple's memory could become unreliable, forcing him to confront identity without perfect recollection. Tim might need to defend the flock against humans who view their unusual behavior as something to exploit. A new mystery could begin without another corpse, allowing the series to explore disappearance, theft, or the attempted destruction of George's farm. The detective framework remains. the emotional wound evolves. There is also a strong argument for stopping. Family cinema rarely permits a successful concept to remain singular, yet The Sheep Detectives gains part of its beauty from completion. George's story is resolved. The flock understands what happened. Rebecca receives a more complicated version of her father. Tim proves useful. Lily learns that remembering pain is better than protecting herself through erasure. Another adventure might entertain, but entertainment alone would be a reduction after a film that treated its ridiculous premise as a path towards something intimate. Its legacy may therefore develop outside direct continuation. The film recalls an older tradition of children's storytelling in which emotional safety did not require the absence of frightening ideas. Contemporary coverage connected its reception to family movies willing to discuss mortality, and parents reported that younger viewers absorbed more of those themes than adults expected. That response matters because it challenges an industrial assumption. Children do not necessarily reject serious material. They reject material that speaks down to them or offers pain without a trustworthy emotional guide. This is where The Sheep Detectives could influence other films even without producing imitators filled with animal investigators. Its lesson is structural. Begin with delight. Establish characters children want to follow. Introduce difficult ideas through an understandable point of view. Refuse to lie about consequences. Then provide emotional movement rather than a magical reversal. George stays dead. Sebastian stays dead. Lily survives the knowledge. That final element is essential. The movie is not teaching children that the world is safe. It is teaching them that painful truth can be faced without ending the possibility of joy. The film's technical legacy may prove equally durable. Photorealistic animals often occupy an uncomfortable space. Too realistic for expressive comedy, too manipulated to feel alive. Balda and Framestore solve much of that problem through bodily restraint. The sheep's movements remain animal while voice, context, and carefully adjusted eyes provide access to thought. Future hybrid productions may borrow that approach, not by copying its sheep, but by understanding that emotional readability does not require turning every creature into a human-shaped performer. Time will decide whether the film becomes a perennial favorite. Its theatrical run already displayed unusual endurance, and streaming gives it access to the repeated viewing patterns through which family films often build their deepest loyalty. Children may return for Reggie and Ronnie smashing a car. Adults may return for Mopple explaining why painful memories deserve protection. Years later, the balance between those two experiences could matter more than opening weekend rank or immediate awards recognition. My extended verdict remains firmly positive. The Sheep Detectives is not a flawless mystery, and its human suspects never become as vivid as the animals investigating them. Its adaptation sacrifices some of the novel's darker ambiguity. A sequel could easily damage the emotional completeness it has already achieved. None of those reservations erase what works. This is a studio family film that uses advanced visual effects to deliver an ancient piece of wisdom. Love creates vulnerability. Loss cannot be solved, and memory is painful because connection was real. Perhaps that should be the final image, not a sheep wearing a detective hat, not a villain being exposed, and not even the flock celebrating its success. A pasture remains after the shepherd has gone. The sheep gather anyway. They carry what he gave them, including the stories that failed to prepare them and the love that prepared them more than they realized. Then they move forward together. Case closed. Life continuing. The Sheep Detectives belongs to several genres, yet it never behaves exactly as any of them should. Its premise promises a talking animal comedy. Its opening death introduces a murder mystery. Its picturesque village suggests cozy crime, while the flock's emotional journey gradually becomes a grief drama. Most films would choose one dominant identity and use the others as decoration. This one keeps changing the ground beneath its audience. A joke leads into fear. A clue opens an emotional wound. A chase suddenly becomes a confrontation with mortality. That instability could have created tonal chaos. Instead, it becomes the film's personality. The cozy mystery framework provides the safest outer shell. George dies within a contained rural community where nearly everyone appears eccentric, secretive, or financially motivated. The suspects are familiar types: the imposing legal authority, the ambitious journalist, the estranged relative, the butcher, the religious figure, and the local resident who seems to know more than politeness permits. The setting promises order even before the crime is solved. This is not an anonymous urban nightmare where danger might come from anywhere. It is a social puzzle. The killer exists inside a limited circle, meaning observation and patience should eventually expose the truth. But the sheep cannot read that genre as fluently as the audience. They understand murder through the detective stories George read aloud, so they expect clues to behave like instructions. A suspicious object must point toward a suspicious person. A strange statement must conceal a secret. Their reasoning resembles a child attempting to apply the rules of fiction directly to life. Sometimes it succeeds. Often it produces comic misunderstanding. The important thing is that the screenplay never presents this as stupidity. The flock follows a system. The system is simply based on stories designed to appear more orderly than reality. That gap between fictional expectation and lived experience gives the mystery its emotional purpose. Lily believes the investigation will end when all the pieces fit: find the criminal, explain the motive, and restore justice. Yet grief does not recognize the structure of a detective novel. George remains dead after the confession. Sebastian's sacrifice cannot be reversed by identifying who caused the original crime. The case reaches an ending, while the character's pain continues beyond it. The film therefore uses the satisfaction of mystery storytelling to reveal the limits of mystery storytelling. Explanations matter. They are not cures. The talking animal comedy operates through a similar reversal. A weaker film would build every scene around sheep attempting human behavior badly. The sheep detectives instead makes human behavior look strange when observed by sheep. Doors become incomprehensible barriers. Paperwork becomes a collection of scented objects. Social rituals appear suspicious because their purpose is invisible from the flock's perspective. The animals are not comic because they lack sophistication. They are comic because they expose how much human civilization depends on unspoken agreements. Remove knowledge of those agreements, and ordinary life starts resembling elaborate nonsense. Physical comedy remains essential, but it follows the animal's anatomy. Mopple cannot conveniently use his hooves like fingers. Reggie and Ronnie solve obstacles by applying force because that is what their bodies permit. A flock attempting stealth immediately faces the problem of being a flock. Their plans collapse through weight, noise, and collective panic rather than random slapstick. The humor grows from limitation, which makes it feel connected to character. Every gag reminds us that intelligence does not erase physical reality. Then the grief drama enters, quietly at first. George's empty chair, the missing sound of his reading voice, and the flock's inability to understand permanence carry more weight than the murder scene itself. The film does not stop being funny when those elements appear. That would divide the story into separate emotional compartments: comedy first, sadness later. Instead, humor continues inside mourning. Mopple remains hungry. Sir Richfield remains grandiose. Reggie and Ronnie remain impulsive. Life does not politely abandon absurdity when tragedy arrives. The coexistence feels truthful because grief rarely controls every second of a person's behavior, even when it controls the direction of their life. This tonal mixture recalls the tradition of family films that use fantasy to make difficult subjects approachable. The animals provide distance. Viewers can confront death through Lily's confusion without being forced immediately into the emotional specificity of losing a parent, partner, or friend. Yet that distance gradually disappears. Once the flock becomes emotionally recognizable, its grief no longer feels metaphorical. The movie has led the audience toward painful material through wool, detective games, and comic misunderstandings. By the time the real subject becomes obvious, affection has already lowered our defenses. The strategy does produce occasional friction. The human mystery is sometimes too lightweight for the emotional seriousness surrounding it. Broad suspects and comic village interactions can feel thin immediately after a scene asks the audience to consider death or memory. Conversely, the grief material may surprise viewers expecting uninterrupted animal comedy. The movie cannot completely satisfy audiences seeking a difficult whodunit, a rapid joke machine, or a devastating drama because it keeps sharing its attention among all three. But that refusal to specialize is also what makes the film memorable. Its mystery gives grief a direction. Its comedy prevents grief from becoming oppressive. Its family film accessibility allows philosophical questions to reach viewers who might resist them in a more solemn form. Each genre compensates for the other's limitations. Cozy crime supplies structure. Animal comedy supplies delight. Drama supplies consequence. The sheep eventually discover that life is not a detective story, but the film never concludes that stories are useless. George's books give them courage, language, and a reason to act together. Fiction fails to explain everything, yet it prepares them to begin asking questions. That is the film's most generous defense of storytelling. A story does not need to contain the complete truth to guide someone toward it. Sometimes a murder mystery cannot solve grief. Sometimes it can teach a frightened flock how to take the first step.